President, reserving the right to object, it would be a gross understatement to say that Alaska tourism, and indeed tourism around the country, is suffering and has been throughout the pandemic. The cruise industry, which accounts for more than 50% of all tourists visiting Alaska every year, has been particularly decimated, not only due to the pandemic, but also because of an arcane law passed by Congress back in 1886. This law, known as the Passenger Vessel Services Act, or PVSA, states that no ship that is foreign-built, foreign-owned, foreign-flagged, or foreign-crewed may transport passengers between two U.S. ports or places. So instead of operating continuously in U.S. waters, ships and cruise operators departing from the United States are forced to make stops in foreign ports in order to remain in compliance with this 130-year-old law. In other words, we're literally shipping our tourism and our economic activity abroad to other countries. And in the process, we're destroying countless opportunities for our own coastal cities, states, and towns. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. You can Google this and see it for yourself. Cruises from the United States, if they leave from the United States, must make stops in Canada, Mexico, or Pacific Island states in order to avoid incurring the wrath and the heavy penalties of the Passenger Vessel Services Act. Instead of welcoming tourists and the dollars they spend into American ports, we drive them to Canada, to Mexico, and to Pacific Island states. Does this law even succeed on its own protectionist terms? Does this law protect American shipbuilders? It decidedly does not. It decidedly does neither, in fact. And just to be clear, this is a point of differentiation here. I've made no secret about the fact that I don't like the Jones Act. The Jones Act is a separate beast from this one. They're both beasts. I dislike both of them intensely. I would repeal both of them today if I had the chance. I understand, at least with respect to the Jones Act, what the arguments are as to why we'd want to keep them intact. I strongly disagree with them, and I believe that U.S. consumers pay for them dearly, especially in places like Puerto Rico and places like Hawaii, and parts of New England, other places where they have more limited access to the goods that they might otherwise have access to in the absence of the Jones Act. There is a big difference between the PVSA and the Jones Act, at least with respect to the Jones Act. There are other considerations, and those considerations do not exist with respect to the PVSA. Now, it's important to keep in mind, again, the difference between the Jones Act and the PVSA is that with the PVSA, we're dealing specifically with passenger vehicles, passenger vessels. And I'm directing my remarks today to those passenger vessels in the large passenger vessel category, that is, those with at least 800 passenger berths or more. With respect to those, this is very significant because the United States has not built a single large cruise ship in over 60 years. Not one, not a single one. With respect to large passenger vessels, this law is literally protecting no one, at least with respect to the Jones Act. People can point out, well, perhaps it's helping to nurture the U.S. shipbuilding industry. Again, I think that argument overlooks the fact that we're laying that burden on the backs of poor and middle-class Americans in places like Puerto Rico and Hawaii and New England and Alaska and other parts of the country. But at least I understand that one. There is an industry at issue there. It's an industry that's being greedy, and it's an industry that really is engaging in crony capitalism. But I understand the argument. With respect to the PVSA, we're not protecting anything because we do not make large passenger vessels in this country and haven't for over half a century. And so by taking away opportunities for American jobs in dockside maintenance and repair, in ports, in coastal cities, and hotels, and restaurants, and the travel support sector, this law, the PVSA, as applied to large passenger vessels, it harms American workers, and it redirects the demand elsewhere. It also harms consumers who have fewer options, fewer cruises that they can take, higher prices for those cruises that are offered. And as we've seen during the pandemic, it's left us subject to the will and whim of foreign powers. So make no mistake, the PVSA is not America first. This is the encapsulation of special interests first, or even you might say Canada first. Perhaps this is the reason that the Canadian government lobbies Congress to keep the PVSA in place. Think about that for a minute. Madam President, this unfortunate situation has been exacerbated by the pandemic, during which Canada has closed its ports to cruise ships, making it effectively impossible for Alaskan cruises to carry on. But the only reason why Canada wields this tremendous authority over us is because of our own law. Our own law that they're lobbying us to keep in place because they benefit from it, but they're shutting it down, making it impossible for Alaskan cruises to happen for the time being. Without the necessary foreign port call, cruises simply cannot travel to Alaska. Without relief, the Alaskan tourism industry will evaporate, harming Alaskan dock workers, repairmen, those in the hospitality services, and more. Just the same, you think about all the jobs that aren't created that could otherwise exist, that could exist tomorrow if we just got rid of this 130-year-old law that serves no purpose. The jobs, the vacation opportunities, especially in port states, not just Alaska, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, New York, many, many others, places where cruise ships already depart but are severely hobbled as to their itineraries because of this law, the PVSA, that serves no one perhaps except these foreign powers. The CDC's outdated no-sail order has made these matters so much worse, and we've got to address those as well. Alaska already lost last summer's season. It's tragic. I can't imagine Congress would force them to lose yet another season now. And yet, that might already be the case. You see, because unless they start moving those ships up there right now, there can't be any cruise ship season for Alaska this summer. Now, my two colleagues from Alaska thankfully introduced a bill to help correct the issue by exempting certain Alaskan cruise lines from the PVSA for the duration of Canada's border closure, a bill that I was happy to support in order to provide short-term relief for Alaska, even if it didn't provide the reform needed for the long term, as we desperately need. Unfortunately, the bill that's now before us has deviated from that purpose. It now has poison pill provisions that add duplicative, unnecessary, and unrelated regulations that will harm, not help, the cruise industry. Look, I remain ready, willing, and eager to negotiate the terms of this. But we've got to provide relief. It's not just about an industry. It's not just about any one state. It's about the access the American people have through their businesses or their own travel interests. They should be able to do this. It makes no sense to anyone. No one would plan a road trip and say that we can't go to a neighboring state unless we can touch back to a foreign country in the meantime. Nobody would fly to an adjacent state or across the country if in the process they had to fly to a third-party country merely in order to comply with some arcane federal law. No one except, of course, the very wealthy who could still afford it. Most Americans can't. And the Americans who can least afford this law that serves no one, perhaps except the foreign interests I mentioned, including but not limited to Canada. The people who really suffer for that are America's workers. Shame on us if we don't fix that. So, look, I remain hopeful, optimistic, and ever willing to negotiate this. I've got lots of amendments to offer up. In deference to my colleagues from Alaska, I'm going to hold off on counter-proposing those right now, but I'm filing them, and they're ready to go, and I hope we can negotiate our way through this. If we can't, shame on us. The PVSA is bad. It's bad news. We need to let it go. For these reasons, Madam President, I object.